What up, guys? Welcome to the Ultimate Travel Podcast. For those of you who haven't been here before, this podcast is about traveling around the world. In each episode, we will meet different and interesting people, tour guides, owners of tourism companies, and local experts who will share their knowledge, which will give you practical tools for planning your next trip. I am your host, Motek, a tour guide in Israel and the Sinai Peninsula, and one who likes to call himself an ultimate traveler. In today's episode, I'll be interviewing Andrew Baxter from Scotland. Andrew is a private tour guide and a phenomenal storyteller. We will talk about what is worth seeing in Scotland, we will talk about the Scottish history, and of course, some good old Scottish whiskey. Give a warm applause for Andrew. Hello, Andrew.
Hello there.
Good to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to this, and thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. So the first question I would like to ask you is how you came to this profession. How did you become a tour guide?
All by accident in many ways. So I have a former career in politics, working in Westminster, in London, and training politicians around the world. And then I moved back to the Scottish Highlands, and I decided that I was going to take a university course up here, which was to train as a tour guide for a year, thinking that maybe, I'd do a few cruise ships that come locally each year. And then after my very first summer, I found I loved it so much. I was so fortunate to be able to show people around the country that I love, that I made it my full-time career.
So you changed from politics to tour guiding. It's super interesting. I mean, maybe in both of them we have a little bit of storytelling, but instead of speaking in front of the public, you speak in front of tourists. So
yeah, I guess the big difference is that as a tour guide, by and large, people listen to me. In politics, by and large, people don't.
All right. So the next thing I want to ask you is, what is Scotland for you?
Oh, as Scotland, first and foremost, it's my home country, where I brought up my family. But it is this most amazing, we call it the most amazing wee country in the world. It's got everything that you could possibly want. Big cities that are diverse and culturally exciting. And then once you're out of them, you've got amazing landscapes, little villages, mountains, forests, and lochs. But above all, I would say, having traveled around the world, we must be one of the most welcoming countries anywhere on this planet.
That's really amazing to hear. I just want to say a bit of a disclaimer to the viewers and listeners that I also have been to Scotland. I've been there 2 times, and I can totally agree with that. But, before I came to Scotland, I had the general knowledge that I think most people in the West have about Scotland, which sums up to Die Hard, with Mel Gibson. And I want to ask you, who are the Scots, right? Who are the people who live there?
Well, that's quite a complicated question to answer, but we're one of the oldest countries, recognized countries in the world, probably date back to around about 700 AD, where there's sort of this amalgamation of different peoples. We had an old tribe called the Picts that were living in mainland Scotland that the Romans encountered when they came this far north. Incidentally, the Picts, they get their name from a Roman word which means the tattooed or painted people. And then we had arrivals from Ireland who were known as the Gaels, and they brought their religion, Christianity, and their language, Gaelic, which we still speak in many parts of Scotland today. And then from the south, up from northern England, we had a tribe known as the Angles. And so we've had all these different influences to create the nation that we have today.
Wow, that's really awesome. So I want to ask you and to talk, not to ask, just to talk with you because you are living in the Highlands, like you said. And I want the audience to understand exactly where is it and what is the Highlands of Scotland, how it's different than the rest of the country.
That's a really good question, and it confuses lots of people when they come here because they think Highlands must mean lots of big mountains, highland, whereas some of it can be quite flat and low level. And it's a line that stretches diagonally from one side of the country in the east down to the west, just north of the city of Glasgow, along an old geological fault. And so everything north of that line is called the Highlands. And yeah, much of it is about lochs and the high mountains, because most of our mountainous area is in the Highlands. But I always say to guests, actually, it's very much about attitude and culture. I would say we're far more laid back in the Highlands. It's a way of life. Culturally, we're quite different from the cities. It's where you're most likely to hear the Gaelic language spoken. And I just think, well, our cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow are wonderful, but the Highlands, well, they will blow you away when you visit here.
So you said a word that really caught my ear, and you said the word loch. And can you explain what that is exactly?
Yes. A loch is the Scots word for a lake or any body of water. And I can tell you the one way to upset any Scotsman when you visit here is to point to a body of water and say, gee, that's a really nice lake. And I can guarantee that you'll get a grumbled look and hear mutter under your breath, that's the English word. We use the Scots word here in Scotland, which is loch.
And there is another word that I heard quite a lot, and also you have a lot of like Scottish whiskey brands that has that word, and that's a glen. What's a glen?
That's a really good question. So a glen is simply the old Scots word for valley. So you'll never hear us talking about valley. We always refer to our glens instead.
Awesome. First, I know when we speak, I remember, I start to remember my trip to Scotland, like 10 years ago. And I remember that one of the most interesting things I've encountered was the different accents of people. I remember that people in Glasgow had a very unique accent. And also I met someone in Fort William that he spoke to me in English, but I couldn't understand a word that he was saying.
Yeah, that's very true. And I'm quite unusual because I have a very strong English accent because I was educated in England, but I've lived most of my adult life here in Scotland. And you're right, Scotland has this plethora of different accents. I'm actually surprised that you understood people in Glasgow because many would say they have the strongest and thickest accent and they speak quite quickly. Whereas just 50 miles away in Edinburgh, I would say they have a much refiner accent, maybe with more of an English accent to it. And do you know, historically, the one place in the whole of the United Kingdom that is said to have spoken the perfect English was actually in Scotland. And it's the small city of Inverness, which is the capital of the Highlands. And they have that claim to fame.
Okay, I've been also to Inverness only to rent a car, so I don't remember exactly if they had the most English, but yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what you do. So you are a tour guide, and what kind of tours do you give for your travelers?
Well, I would first of all say I have the best job in the world, being a tour guide and a tour guide in Scotland. And I do absolutely every type of tour, and that's why I enjoy it so much. So from a walking tour around the historic battlefield of Culloden, to jumping on a coach and taking cruise ship passengers to the Isle of Skye, Just last week, I had a lovely family of 5 Americans who I drove round Perthshire in central Scotland, discovering some off the beaten path places around there. So in many ways, every day as a tour guide for me is very different because I have so many different types of tours that I lead as a guide.
I can totally relate because I also do the same in Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. And, we are really fortunate to work in this profession, especially when we meet so many interesting people from different places. I mean, from my experience, the sites are usually the same, the stories, we remember them, but the people that we guide and the people that we meet, and then when they share about their lives and their stories, and that's really also an amazing thing that adds to our profession.
Yeah, that's very true. Every tour is different because of the people that you're with. And, I also learn a lot from the people that I'm guiding as well, because they're in a new place, a new country, maybe for many of them in a new culture. So I'm always fascinated with the questions that they ask you. And they can come up with really interesting questions that, as a native Scot, you've never really considered about your country. That will maybe for an instant completely throw you, but then make you think, oh, yes, I never realized that. So I think that's one of the beauties of our job.
Yeah. And that I think about it, that especially people in the West, I guess that a lot of people in North America, they have some association with Scotland. A lot of people have Scottish ancestry, like blood running in their veins. Mm-hmm. A lot of people play golf, and for what I know, golf was invented in Scotland. So it's like people they know something, they have this perception of that place, of Scotland, but then they come and they see it in a whole different way, and they're lit up, and that's probably amazing.
Yeah, it is. You're right. Lots of North Americans and also Australians and New Zealanders have family links, family heritage back to Scotland, which attracts them here. And golf, as you say, is a big driver. Do you know, it's really interesting. The group that I had last week, we were talking about golf, and they were really keen golfers. And they claimed actually golf wasn't invented here in Scotland. They claimed it was from Holland.
Oh, come on.
Laid out a whole host of reasons why that was so. So I didn't disabuse them of that fact, but maybe during the winter months, I'm going to have to research that a bit more in detail. But we'll just take it that golf was invented here in Scotland.
I believe that. So, Andrew, let's now talk a little bit about traveling to Scotland. So, first of all, I would like to ask you, what is the proper time period to travel in Scotland? For how long should I come?
Well, it very much depends on what you want to do and where you're going. You could, if you have only a short period of time, you could spend a long weekend in somewhere like Edinburgh or Glasgow, or even fly straight into Inverness, and you'll get a really decent flavour of those areas. But if you want to head out of the cities, you want to explore the countryside, particularly come up to where I am in the Highlands, I really reckon that you need a minimum of 5 days, if not longer, to explore it. One of the things that surprises many people coming to Scotland is they look at their map and they see, oh, it's a short distance between these two places, it won't take very long. And then they suddenly discover our roads. And our roads, particularly outside the cities north of Edinburgh and Glasgow, are quite narrow. They're quite twisty-turny, and they're quite slow to drive along. I don't know. You said you hired a car from Inverness. I'm pretty sure you experienced some of those roads when you headed around the Highlands, so you'll know how much time it takes people to visit here. And why do you want to hurry anyway when you've got an amazing country to visit?
Definitely. First of all, I hired the car. Like, I was 2 times in Scotland. The first one was for traveling. The second one was for an amazing wedding of a good friend of mine. He's Scottish and he's from the area of St. Andrews. So we rented a car, to help with the preparations and all of that. And but I remember on my first trip to Scotland that me and my friend Ben, we hitchhiked from Fort William all the way somewhere down south. I don't remember where, but some very nice person, like a couple, gave us a ride. And on the map, it looked like maybe it will be a 2.5 hour drive. It at the end, it took us about 6 hours, but it was a beautiful ride. We passed a lot of those lochs and glens and mountains, and it was great at the end. But yeah, definitely, I remember it takes lots of time going from one place to another. So so let's say I come to Scotland, and you know what? I will take my standards. Let's say I have 2 weeks. Okay, so I think it's a decent time for experiencing such a beautiful country. And let's say that I fly to where? I fly to Glasgow or I fly to Edinburgh. Where should I fly to?
Either of those cities are fantastic, or if you have to route through London, I would consider flying to Inverness, particularly if you want to explore the Highlands, because then you're right in the heart of the Highlands and you've cut out a bit of travel heading out of this what we call the central belt of Scotland. But all of those places are really good hubs to fly into.
Okay, so you know what? Before we focus on the getting to the Highlands, let's talk a little bit about the highlights of visiting places in Scotland, such as Edinburgh. I remember Edinburgh is a really beautiful city. I remember also there are a lot of students living there. And it's it's live, it's a vibrant city. So let's talk a little bit about Edinburgh.
Yeah, you're right. Edinburgh is in many ways a very international city, helped by the huge student population. It's one of the best universities in the world at the University of Edinburgh. And Edinburgh is an ancient city as well. We have, really a city of two halves. We have the ancient old town that stretches up the Royal Mile, a volcanic hill. And when that became too crowded in the 16 and 1700s, and it was full of too many people and rubbish and sewage flowing through the streets, the rich and noble people of Edinburgh built a new city just a short distance away, which is called the New Town, which has these beautiful Georgian houses and private parks with trees and grass, a very pretty part of the city. So there's lots to see. There are fantastic museums from the National Museum of Scotland, which is you could get lost in there for months within there, or the castle itself, which I've also mentioned, or Holyrood Palace, which is the official residence of King Charles III, our monarch, when he visits Scotland. And then on top of all of that, if you come here during August, you've got all the pomp and ceremony of the marching bands that are here for the Royal Military Tattoo that's held in Edinburgh Castle every evening. So you'll hear the bagpipes and the drummers from around the world playing there, and it finishes with a huge firework display. Or you could come along for what must be the world's biggest art and culture festival anywhere on this planet, which is the Edinburgh Festival and the Fringe, which, if you like theatre or music or comedy, is one worth coming to see.
So yeah, let's talk like the Fringe. Now I totally forgot about it. So I was there during the Fringe time, the first time I was in Scotland. I'm not really a big theater enthusiast, like a fan, but I remember it to be an amazing event. Like people were doing these plays in the streets. There were a lot of music events as well. So like you said, the Fringe takes place at the end of August, right?
Really, the whole of August. It's the first weekend of August and runs all the way through the month.
Yes. So that comes to another question I had. When is the best time to come and visit Scotland?
Oh, I get asked that question a lot, and it de- it depends. I would say whenever you can. Um, there's no best time for the weather because we're on an island. Our weather can change at the click of a fingers, and I always say to people, be ready for all four seasons in one day in Scotland. I personally, I reckon May, June, September, October, the weather can be a little bit more settled, maybe not so busy as it is when everyone's on holiday here in August. If you want to get away from the crowds, maybe those are the better months. Or more and more people are now coming to Scotland during the winter months. And okay, the daylight hours are a lot shorter than the summer, but you get a completely different feel for the country when you're here during the winter. Snow on the mountains, bright sunshine if it's nice, cold weather. Perfect.
When I got the first time to Scotland, I took the bus from London all the way to Glasgow, I think. And the driver, he was Scottish, and he told me, if you don't like the Scottish weather, just wait 15 minutes.
That's so true. Very true indeed.
It's important for our audience to know that Scotland, even in the summertime, can be a bit rainy. And, if you are considering traveling there, so bring proper gear, like bring a good raincoat and stuff like that. It's not cold. I remember it was very pleasant. I even went down and swam in one of the lochs there. And
that's brave.
Yeah, but I also remember you have these awful little flies that are called, remind me how they're called?
They're called the midge or midges. Yeah.
Horrible. I think they exist in only two places. One is Scotland and the second is hell, basically.
That's a really good way of putting it. Just to explain to everyone, the Highland midge is a pinprick of an insect, and they've been known to make grown men cry, particularly if they're wearing a kilt, because they bite and they swarm. They're attracted to the carbon dioxide in our breath, so there's no getting away of them. And they like damp, humid, overcast weather. And during the summer months, we get quite a lot of that in the Scottish Highlands. You won't find them in places like Glasgow or Edinburgh or the south of the country. It tends to be on the west coast and Fort William and the area around there where you visited is particularly renowned for them.
Yeah. I really, I'm holding myself because I have a lot of questions about the Highlands, because that's really, for me, that's really the epicenter of visiting Scotland, like the nature and the little towns and villages, and of course the whiskey distilleries and the castles. We will all get to there. But first, I want to ask you of another city that is not in the Highlands per se, and then I hope we'll get to the Highlands.
Sure.
St. Andrews. Okay, St. Andrews is, for people who don't know, it's the birthplace of modern golf. They have the oldest golf course in the world. Andrew, I just want to say up front, I'm not a golfer. I've never played golf. And the only time I was there was just on the other side of the street of that famous golf course, and I ate fish and chips in a local pub.
Good choice.
But for people who I won't say like into golf, but into that maybe history and all, is there something worth doing in St. Andrews?
Oh, absolutely. Don't be put off by all the sort of travel brochures that feature photos of the golf course at St. Andrews, which is fantastic, and it's a big part of the town. But it has a really important history as well. It has the oldest university in the whole of Scotland, in St Andrews, where royalty studies. So Prince William, the King's son, and his wife, Kate Middleton, both met as students at St Andrews University. And there are other historical sites that you can see there. There's the ruins of the castle and what was once one of the grandest cathedrals in the whole of Europe, laid waste during that religion, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church that we know as the Reformation that swept across Europe. Just the ruins remain now, but they are so evocative. And the town itself is full of wonderful little cafes, shops, and possibly some of the best ice cream that you will find anywhere in Scotland at a place called Ginetta's. So head there for some delicious ice cream once you finish your fish and chips.
You heard him, ladies and gentlemen. Go to that ice cream place. So that's awesome. That's really awesome. For the people who are listening to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Music, and you don't see the video, I'm just smiling the whole way when Andrew is explaining about Scotland, because it really brings me fun memories of my time there. And it's like you said in the beginning of the episode, the Scottish people are just awesome. Like, they're just so friendly, welcoming. I remember every person I met in Scotland, well, almost every person, was really like asking me questions, where I'm from, like really, they were interested in me. And that's always, as a traveler, like when you get to a place where local people ask you, hey, who are you? It's always bring up the country and the place on a good scale. So
absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I find when I'm traveling anywhere, I want to talk to local people because you get the feeling for a place if you talk to local residents. And I say to people traveling to Scotland, don't be afraid about just striking up a conversation with someone in a shop or in a cafe. You'll find that almost all of the time they will respond back to you and they'll ask questions about you. They'll be interested in you. And you'll learn so much more about Scotland by doing that.
So, Andrew, another question before the Highlands. Sorry, just that
we will get there.
We'll get to the Highlands. We promise we'll get to the Highlands. I remember when I got to Fort William, which Fort William is in the Highlands, I saw this beautiful, beautiful train, steam engine train, that drove on the railroad all the way down to Fort William. And then somebody told me, that's the train from the Harry Potter movies. That's exactly the train. I think it's maybe the only remaining steam engine train in the UK. I'm not sure, but...
There's many others, but it's one of the most impressive for sure.
Yes, it is very impressive. And then when people that person told me about Harry Potter and the train, I realized that Harry Potter was originally written in Edinburgh by forgot her name, J.K. Rowling.
J.K. Rowling, yeah.
Yeah. And is there like people who are into Harry Potter or I don't know, maybe they travel with kids? So are there any like Harry Potter-oriented tours or activities in Scotland?
Oh, yes. You can't take more than 2 steps in Edinburgh, in particular, to stumble across a Harry Potter tour. And as it happens, during the COVID lockdown, which we try and forget now, I hosted a Harry Potter's Virtual Scotland, taking people around Edinburgh, the places that inspired J.K. Rowling, and then to the Highlands, where they filmed many of the movies. So the train that you mentioned, which is called the Jacobite Express, travels from Fort William for about 50 miles all the way to the west of Scotland, and it flies over something, drives over something called the Glenfinnan Viaduct, which today is more commonly known as the Harry Potter Bridge, because that appears in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets as Harry and Ron fly over the Hogwarts Express in the car that they've taken off Ron's dad, the flying blue Ford Anglia, and it appears in many of the other movies. And in fact, just a short distance from my village, one of my favourite Harry Potter movies, The Prisoner of Azkaban, and Hagrid's Hut was filmed. So yeah, you can come not just to Edinburgh, but to even better to the Highlands, and do your own Harry Potter tour if you wanted.
Okay, so the drums roll. Now we are getting finally to the Highlands. Finally. Okay. So, okay, what should I do when I come to the Highlands? What should I see?
Well, my first tip is to take your time and not hurry, because there is so much to see and you want to soak in the atmosphere, and you've got so many choices. Many people head to the Isle of Skye, which is part of the Highlands. And before we started this interview, we were chatting about this, and you said you had visited it, and you reckoned it was the most beautiful place on earth, which is quite an accolade. And it's the landscape on the Isle of Skye is incredible. But I would say venture beyond that, and maybe visit some of the other islands. Hop over a little bit further to Skye to the islands of Harris and Lewis, which is very different from the mainland, and has some really ancient sites. The famous Cannonish stones, which are even older than the standing stones at Stonehenge, which most of us have heard of.
Mm-hmm.
I would head to Inverness. You just picked up a car there, but Inverness is a great little city with a beautiful river flowing through it, a good place to drink a dram or two of whiskey, and not too far from a very famous loch, which I'm sure everyone's heard of, which is Loch Ness.
Yes.
Home of the mysterious Loch Ness monster.
What's her name?
So
she has a name, right?
Oh, Nessie is her name. Yeah, Nessie. Did you see her when you were there?
Yes, no. But I remember I did a hike around Loch Ness with my friend Ben, and it was nice, but then it was just for the kicks of it, and then we returned to Fort William. So, I stopped you, and I apologize, but I want for our audience to understand. So Inverness is situated like in the northeast, right? Like it's on and then Fort William is right on that, next to Loch Ness, which is more like in the center.
The central southwest. So
yes.
You're right. Inverness is up in the northeast. We call it the capital of the Highlands because it gives you great access to the Highlands. But really, the bulk of the Highlands that everyone knows is to the west of that, heading down to Fort William. And not far from there, near where I live, Glencoe.
Yes.
Which has some of the most incredible mountain scenery that you'll find anywhere in Scotland. It's my backyard. And I've never been able to take it for granted. I still pinch myself when I drive through the pass of Glencoe, saying to myself how lucky I am to live here. And whatever the weather, even if it's absolutely tipping down with rain, you will be impressed with Glencoe because it's so scenic. And it has a really interesting and sadly bloody past, because it's the site of something called the Glencoe Massacre way back in 1692, when the government sanctioned the murder of a whole clan called Clan MacDonald. So if you visit Glencoe, find out a bit more about the massacre of Glencoe and what happened in that very beautiful glen all those centuries ago.
Andrew, I just want to emphasize about what you said, because I've passed in Glencoe. Actually, I think I've been there twice in my trip, and it's really amazing. The valley there, the glen, It's really amazing, and the mountains. And, this is something that I always tell people, like when people ask me, why should I hire like a local tour guide? I can rent a car and go there by myself. But here, that's a good example. When I was in Glencoe, I haven't heard a word, anything about that massacre that you just mentioned, and like a very important historical story. And that's that's the benefit of traveling with a tour guide. They show you things that you didn't know exist. So thank you for that. And going back to the question, so you say it's better to start like my trip in the Highlands from Inverness, and should I like aim to go to Fort William and do the trip in between?
Or you've got lots of choices. You could do that, start from Inverness, or as many people do, start from Edinburgh and Glasgow and head up northwards. Where to Fort William, it's about a 3-hour drive from the centre of Edinburgh. If you did it all in one go, but of course you wouldn't want to. You'd want to stop off and see places on the way. It is well, I could spend the whole of the next week talking to you about the Highlands and everything to see. There is so much to see. It's so much history, so much culture, and we haven't even got onto the legends and myths that swirl around the mountains and the lochs in the Highlands. And whilst I'm at it, can I just say, your pronunciation of loch, I'm so impressed with that. It is so spot on. So that's really great.
It's because in my language we have that sound, the ha, so that's why I can say it. I'm sure someone from Glasgow will disagree with you about my loch saying, but so okay. Before we get to this, we have I just want to say also to the audience and to ourselves, we have a lot of things to cover in this episode because we're talking about Scotland. Like Scotland has so much to offer, and we are talking about the places, but then we'll get also to some recommendations of actual activities.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned a place that I also, before our interview, I said it's really an amazing place, and that's the island of Skye. Can you talk a little bit about the island of Skye?
Yeah, so the island of Skye is one of the Hebrides, a whole chain of islands off the west coast. It is the largest of Scotland's islands, and today it's really easy to get to because we have a bridge that has stood there for nearly 30 years connecting it to the mainland. It has a relatively small population, about 10,000 people living on it. The main town is a pretty little town with a harbour called Portree, which is the main base on the island. I suspect most people come to Skye today because of its somewhat otherworldly landscape. Skye was formed millions of years ago with huge volcanic eruptions and forces, and then that has shaped the landscape over a million years since. And it's really difficult to describe it unless you see it. I recommend to listeners or viewers to Google and look up photos of Isle of Skye landscape, and then they begin to understand it. And we have famous places like Kilt Rock, which is a huge rock that points up into the sky below some eroded cliffs, or a famous waterfall called Hilt Rock, which is meant to look at like the pleats of the back of a Scotsman's kilt. Or you may want to visit Fairy Glen, which is said to be the home of the wee folk, as we call them in Scotland, the fairies, and that's completely different from the rest of the island. It's a big, brooding, scenic landscape, and it seems as though every corner that you drive round, you have a completely different view from what you saw before. Does that give it justice from your point of view, having visited?
Pretty much so. I just want to tell you a story of my experience in the island of Skye, if I may. So I was traveling there 10 years ago with a good friend of mine. His name is Ben. And Ben, he's a former, elite unit the Israeli military. He was in a unit that is similar to the American Navy SEALs, so really tough guys. And we got to the island of Skye, and we asked people, where is the harshest area to hike in the islands of Skye? And people told us, the Black Coolins. Go to the Black Coolins. For our listeners and viewers, the Black Coolins is a mountain range that also, I think it's volcanic, but it's really like rugged, pointy mountains, black, really, really beautiful. And me and Ben said, okay, let's do it. So we went to a local shop. We bought food, ingredients for maybe a 5-day hike. We bought a map from some local shop. We covered it with nylon. We carried a lot. Back then, also, we were much stronger than today, but we carried a lot, and we said, okay, we actually, drew the path on the map by ourselves. We said, here, we were going to stay overnight and so on. And we started the hike. So we got off a bus, and we started to walk towards the Black Coolins. And then, all of a sudden, as we start approaching the mountains, we see like the sky was so dark and there were so many thunders and rain started. We said, it's okay. And we started to walk. And then we just got to the beginning of the mountains. We looked up and my friend Ben said, Motek, let's not die today.
Yeah.
So I told him, that's a brilliant idea. So we went back to the road. We hitchhiked. And we met 2 French guys that they were on a bicycle trip. I mean, they had their own van with the bicycles inside, but they wanted to do a bike trip in the island of Skye. And because of the rain, also they've canceled their plans. And then they told us, what do you think we should do? And I suggested, let's go to a distillery. We are in Scotland. Have you been to a distillery? They said no. And I said, okay, we haven't as well, so let's go to a distillery. We went to a distillery, and that was our Black Coolin story at the end.
Very sensible.
Yeah, so now, because of that story, let's talk about something that Scotland is really famous for. I know that it attracts a lot of people. People consume that product worldwide. The famous Scottish whiskey.
Yeah, Ushkava, which is its Gaelic word for Ushkava, which means the water of life, is the literal translation. And yeah, we're renowned for whiskey. Over 100 distilleries, if not more, are making the water of life. Many of them are open, so you can visit them. I suspect the one that you went to on Skye is the world famous Talisker distillery, which is a very unique flavor, said to be influenced by the fact that the distillery is close to the sea. It's meant to be salty and iodine in flavor and slightly smoky. The most famous region for whiskey in the whole of Scotland is actually to the other side of Inverness, a place called Scotalnd, which has something like 60 distilleries along the River Spey, and some really famous brands from there like Glenlivet or Glenfiddich, Glenfarclas, and most of those distilleries are open as well. And I really recommend booking a distillery tour, even if you're not interested in whiskey whatsoever, or you don't like the taste of it. It's an interesting experience to go around and see how much effort is put into producing whiskey, which is our biggest food and drink export from Scotland. We sell millions and millions and millions of barrels of whiskey or bottles around the world every year. So it's a big part of our life here in Scotland.
So, I know there is a competition between Ireland and Scotland. Who was the first one to invent the whiskey? So when I asked people from Ireland, I was also in Ireland a few years ago, they said, oh, of course it was here. And then when I asked people from Scotland, they say, no, it's of course a Scottish invention. So,
and it doesn't really matter, because all that counts is that Scotland has the better whiskey.
Oh yeah, definitely. 100%. 100%. Bigger variety, better quality.
I've
So
probably upset all my Irish friends now by saying
yes. Now they're going to defriend you. It's like in my region, it's from Israel in the Middle East, so people compete who invented the hummus, the hummus first, but doesn't matter. Everybody eats hummus here, so
yeah.
Okay, so Andrew, now I want to ask you, so this is coming for the second part of the interview, which is more about like recommendations, if you have, of specific things. So let's start with, let's say, accommodation. So let's start with Edinburgh. Do you have any recommendations for good hotels or something like that in Edinburgh?
Oh, there's so much to choose from in Edinburgh, from every budget as well. If you are looking to splurge and money is no object, then somewhere like the Balmoral Hotel at the end of Princey Street, right in the centre of the city, is probably the best hotel in Edinburgh. And incidentally, where the author J.K. Rowling wrote the very last Harry Potter book, The Deathly Hallows. And I believe you can even stay in the J.K. Rowling suite where she finished the book. I think it costs £1,500 a night to stay in that particular room. But I'm sure not everyone's budget goes to that. So there's lots of many more affordable options. And if you're a backpacker, hosteler, there's not that I've ever stayed in any, there's lots of hostels in Edinburgh as well. And actually my top tip is if you're coming here during the summer months, much of the student accommodation, the halls of residence in the university, you can book a room in there. I quite often do that if I've got tours starting in Edinburgh. That's a really good, affordable way of staying in the city.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And do you have a recommendation for interesting restaurants in Edinburgh?
Well, you can find Edinburgh is one of those cities, a bit like London, where you can find virtually every cuisine in the city. You just have to wander along and take your pick. One of my favourite restaurants is on the Royal Mile opposite St Giles's Cathedral, and it's called Luckin Booths. And the Luckin Booths, which used to, that's an old Scots word. They were little sort of market stalls that used to line the street outside the St Giles's Cathedral. And I would try the haggis pie. Now, we haven't mentioned haggis yet.
We haven't.
Haggis pie is, well, it's their creation. It's a bit like a cottage or shepherd's pie made with haggis as the bottom layer and then creamy mashed potato on the top. That's my go-to meal when I head to Luckin Booths.
And what does haggis made out of?
Oh, well, first of all, before I answer that question, I'm going to caveat it because people go, "Oh, that's so disgusting." And I always say to guests, if you've ever eaten a hot dog or a sausage, then haggis is no worse than that. So haggis traditionally is made of a mixture of oatmeal, onion, animal fat, and then sheep's lung, heart, and liver, all mixed up with lots of black pepper and a secret blend of herbs and spices. Traditionally, it was cooked in the sheep's stomach, but we don't tend to cook it in that anymore. It's more like a sausage skin or an artificial casing. And I can tell you that this is food from heaven. It is incredible.
I tried haggis and it's interesting, let's say it this way. I mean, it's not as bad as it sounds. It's very good, but it's interesting flavor. I really recommend everybody to at least try it out.
Try it once.
Yeah. Let's talk about distilleries. Do you have like recommendations for distilleries, whiskey distilleries that one should visit?
Where do you start? Because you almost stumble, even in Edinburgh and Glasgow, there's distilleries today. You sort of stumble over them everywhere you go in the Highlands. You've really stumped me there. I'm going to tell you Glenfiddich. And the only reason I'm doing that is because I used to live quite close to Glenfiddich distillery when I lived in the Highlands. It's in a small village called Dufton, which at one time, just this small village used to have 7 working distilleries, which is incredible. And although Glenfiddich is a famous brand, it's a fantastic distillery tour to head round there. So, but I'll just take your pick. There's too many to choose from.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that I remember very clearly about Scotland is the huge number of different castles there. Mm-hmm. And everywhere you go, there is like a beautiful castle somewhere. So do you have any recommendations for like a must-see castles in the Highlands?
Oh, absolutely. Without hesitation. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because this is right on the edge of the Highlands.
That's fine.
My favourite castle is Stirling Castle, which is like a miniature version of Edinburgh Castle. It sits on a volcanic rock. I was there just on Saturday. It's at the top of an old medieval town. And even in the middle of the summer, even when there's lots of visitors there, it never feels crowded or whatsoever. And as for the Highlands, well, I suppose I would have to mention possibly the most photographed castle anywhere in Scotland, which is on the way to Skye, just off the road. You drive past it, you can't miss it, and it's called Donnan Castle. That sits on a little island with a little bridge going across it. It's so beautiful. And maybe I should tell everyone that actually it's a bit of a mock castle because it looks as though it's 1,000 years old. It's actually only 100 years old because it was rebuilt in the early 1900s. Rebuilt the original castle that was blown up by the British Navy in 1715 or 1719. It was blown up by the British Navy and wasn't rebuilt until almost 200 years later.
All right. And any other recommendations like for things around Fort William, perhaps?
Yes, there is. If you like hiking, I would head just out of the town, round the bottom slopes of Ben Nevis. So we're not going to go high up here. Lots of people would head up Ben Nevis, but it's not to everyone's taste. Drive along Glen Nevis for about 8 miles until you get to the very end where the road runs out. And that's the trailhead for something called the Steel Gorge, which is almost alpine like gorge where the river flows through a narrow gap in the mountains. And after a mile, you'll suddenly emerge into a flat-bottomed glen, which is almost alpine meadow in like. And at the very end of it, you're faced with a mountainous wall with amazing waterfall flowing down it. It's a really scenic spot, a really great walk. And for the Harry Potter fans amongst us, you may recognize it as a place where Harry played Quidditch.
So just for our audience, you said the Ben Nevis. The Ben Nevis is the highest mountain in the UK. I think it's about 1,300 meters above sea level or something like that.
That's right. Well done. Yeah.
And the thing is that it's a very known tourist attraction. People come, to hike the highest mountain in the UK. You can do that. It takes, I think, between 6 to 8 hours. It's not like a multi-day. It's just a one-day activity. But I think 300 days out of the year, it's just covered with clouds and moist. So maybe you will climb up there and you'll just be in the middle of a cloud. But that's also something that people do. It's like an activity that is worth mentioning. And Andrew, just before we finish, do you have any other golden tips, like tips that will really change someone's visit to Scotland?
I'm going to suggest somewhere to visit because everyone or lots of people go to the Isle of Skye, which is fantastic place to go. But I would recommend two other islands and a town. So head a little further south than Fort William to a place called Oban, which we call the gateway to the Isles. It has some of the most fantastic seafood that you'll find in Scotland. Right next to the ferry terminal, you'll find a little wooden shack where they will cook up mussels and scallops and langoustine, and then you can just eat them on the dockside there before you get on a ferry across to the Isle of Mull, which is like Skye in miniature. And right at the other end of that particular island, you get on an even smaller ferry that takes 10 minutes to get across to the holy island of Iona, which is only a couple of miles long, less than a mile wide. And that's where a great man called Saint Columba first brought Christianity to Scotland and spread it across the whole of the Highlands and the rest of Scotland. An abbey stands where he first set up his monastery. And even if you have no religious bent whatsoever, Iona is such a peaceful, tranquil place, perfect place to go and just spend a few hours getting away from the hurly-burly of everyday life, finding a place to sit down and look out across the ocean to the other islands. I can't think of any better place to be on a bright, blue, sunny day in the middle of summer. And I just encourage anyone that's visiting the Highlands to make the effort to get to Iona.
Wow, thank you so much. Andrew, how people can reach out to you if they are looking for a tour guide in Scotland?
You can find me on my website, which is glentoglen.com. So the number 2 in the middle, glentoglen.com. And you'll also find me on Facebook if you search for Glen to Glen, where I have lots of tips about places that you can visit in Scotland and food and drink that you can try.
Andrew, it was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about Scotland and your stories and your recommendations. It really helps a lot other people and travelers. And I hope they will choose to come to Scotland and choose you as well.
It's been a pleasure. Now, we never say goodbye in the Highlands if we can help it. And as we've sort of been on a virtual tour of the Highlands today, I'm not going to say goodbye. I'm going to use a Scottish phrase that we use instead, which is haste ye back.
Haste you back. That's great. Thank you so much, Andrew.
My pleasure. My pleasure.